Chapter 18. Lady Dedlock. It was not so easy as it had appeared at first to arrange Richard's making a trial of Mr. Kenge's office. Richard himself was the chief impediment. As soon as he had it in his power to leave Mr. Badger at any moment, he began to doubt whether he wanted to leave him at all. He didn't know, he said. Really, it wasn't a bad profession. He could assert that he disliked it. Perhaps he liked it as well as he liked any other. Suppose he gave it one more chance. Upon that, he shut himself up for a few weeks with some books and some bones, and seemed to acquire a considerable fund of information with great rapidity. His fervour, after lasting about a month, began to cool, and when it was quite cooled, began to grow warm again. His vacillations between law and medicine lasted so long that midsummer arrived before he finally separated from Mr. Badger, and entered on an experimental course of Messrs. Kenge and Carboy. For all his waywardness, he took great credit to himself as being determined to be earnest this time, and he was so good-natured throughout, and in such high spirits, and so fond of Ada, that it was difficult indeed to be otherwise than pleased with him. As to Mr. Jarndyce, who I may mention found the wind much given during this period to stick in the east, as to Mr. Jarndyce, Richard would say to me, "He is the finest fellow in the world, Esther. I must be particularly careful, if it were only for his satisfaction, to take myself well to task and have a regular wind-up of this business now." The idea of his taking himself well to task with that laughing face and heedless manner, with the fancy that everything could catch and nothing could hold, was ludicrously anonymous. However, he told us between whiles that he was going to do it to such an extent that he wondered if his hair didn't turn grey. His regular wind-up of the business was, as I have said, that he went to Mr. Kenge's about midsummer to try out how he liked it. All this time he was in money affairs what I have described him in a former illustration: generous, profuse, wildly careless, but fully persuaded that he was rather calculating and prudent. I happened to say to Ada in his presence, half jestingly, half seriously, about the time of his going to Mr. Kenge's, that he needed to have a Fortunatus purse, he made so light of money, which she answered in this way: "My jewel of a dear cousin, you hear this old woman? Why does she say that? Because I gave £8 odd, or whatever it was, for a certain neat waistcoat and buttons a few days ago. Now, if I had stayed at Badger's, I should have been obliged to spend £12 at a blow for some heart-breaking lecture fees. So I make £4 in a lump by the transaction." It was a question much discussed between him and my guardian what arrangements should be made for his living in London while he experimented on the law, for we had long since gone back to Bleak House, and it was too far off to admit of his coming there oftener than once a week. My guardian told me that if Richard were to settle down at Mr. Kenge's, he would take some apartments or chambers where we could occasionally stay for a few days at a time. "But, little woman," he added, rubbing his head very significantly, "he hasn't settled down there yet." The discussions ended in our hiring for him by the month a neat little furnished lodging in a quiet old house near Queen Square. He immediately began to spend all the money he had in buying the oddest little ornaments and luxuries for this lodging, and so often as Ada and I dissuaded him from making any purchase that he had in contemplation, which was particularly unnecessary and expensive, he took credit for what it would have cost, and made out that to spend anything less on something was to save the difference. We made a pleasant journey down into Lincolnshire by the coach, and had an entertaining companion in Mr. Skimpole. His furniture had been cleared off, it appeared, by the person who took possession of it on his blue-eyed daughter's birthday, but he seemed quite relieved to think that it was gone. Chairs and table, he said, were wearisome objects. They were monotonous ideas. They had no variety of expression. They looked you out of countenance, and you looked them out of countenance. How pleasant, then, to be bound to no particular chairs and tables, and to sport like a butterfly among all the furniture on hire, and to flit from rosewood to mahogany, and from mahogany to walnut, and from this shape to that, as the humour took one. "The oddity of the thing is," said Mr. Skimpole, with a quickened sense of the ludicrous, "that my chairs and tables were not paid for, yet my landlord walks off with them as composedly as possible. Now that seems droll. There's something grotesque in it. The chair and table merchant never engaged to pay my landlord my rent. Why should my landlord quarrel with him?" If I have a pimple on my nose, which is disagreeable to my landlord's peculiar ideas of beauty, my landlord has no business to scratch my chair and table merchant's nose, which has no pimple on it. His reasoning seems defective." "Well," said my guardian good-humouredly, "it's pretty clear that whoever became security for those chairs and tables will have to pay for them." "Exactly," returned Mr. Skimpole. "That's the crowning point of unreason in the business. I said to my landlord, 'My good man, you're not aware that my excellent friend Jarndyce will have to pay for those things which you're sweeping off in that indelicate manner. Have you no consideration for his property?' He hadn't the least." "And refused all proposals," said my guardian. "Refused all proposals," returned Mr. Skimpole. "I made him business proposals. I had him into my room. I said, 'You're a man of business, I believe?' He replied, 'I am.' 'Very well,' said I. 'Now let us be businesslike here. Here's an inkstand. Here are pens and paper. Here are wafers. What do you want? I have occupied your house for a considerable period, I believe to our mutual satisfaction, until this unpleasant misunderstanding arose. Let us be at once friendly and businesslike. What do you want?' In reply to this he made use of the figurative expression, which has something Eastern about it, that he had never seen the colour of my money. 'My amiable friend,' said I never have any money. I never know anything about money.' 'Well, sir,' said he, 'what do you offer if I give you time?' 'My good fellow,' said I have no idea of time. But you say you're a man of business, and whatever you can suggest to be done in a business-like way with pen, ink, and paper and wafers, I am ready to do. Don't pay yourself at another man's expense, which is foolish, but be business-like.' However, he wouldn't be, and there was an end of it. If these were some of the inconveniences of Mr. Skimpole's childhood, it assuredly possessed its advantages too. On the journey he had a very good appetite for such refreshment as came in our way, including a basket of choice hothouse peaches, and never thought of paying for anything. So when the coachman came round for his fee, he presently asked him what he considered a very good fee indeed. Now a liberal one, and on his replying 1/2 crown for a single passenger, it was little enough too, all things considered, and left Mr. Jarndyce to give it him. It was delightful weather. The green corn waved so beautifully, the larks sang so joyfully, the hedges were so full of wild flowers, the trees were so thickly out in leaf, the bean fields with a light wind blowing over them filled the air with such a delicious fragrance. Late in the afternoon we came to the market town where we were to alight for the coach. A dull little town, with a church spire and a market-place, and a market cross, and one intensely sunny street, and a pond with an old horse cooling his legs in it, and a very few men sleepily lying and standing about in narrow little bits of shade. After the rustling of the leaves, the waving of the corn along the road, it looked as still, as hot, as motionless as a little town in England could produce. At the inn we found Mr. Boythorn on horseback, waiting with an open carriage to take us to his house, which was a few miles off. He was overjoyed to see us, and dismounted with great alacrity. "By heaven," said he, after giving us a courteous greeting, "this is a most infamous coach. It is the most flagrant example of an abominable public vehicle that ever encumbered the face of the earth. It's 25 minutes after its time this afternoon. The coachman ought to be put to death." "Is he after his time?" said Mr. Skimpole, to whom he happened to address himself. "You know my infirmity." 25 minutes, 26 minutes," replied Mr. Boythorn, referring to his watch. "With 2 ladies in the coach, this scoundrel has deliberately delayed his arrival 26 minutes. Deliberately! It's impossible that it can be accidental. But his father and his uncle were the most profligate coachmen that ever sat upon a box." While he said this in tones of the greatest indignation, he handed us into the little phaeton with the utmost gentleness, and was all smiles and pleasure. "I'm sorry, ladies," he said, standing bareheaded at the carriage door, which was all ready, "that I am obliged to conduct you nearly 2 miles out of the way. But our direct road lies through Sir Leicester Dedlock's park. I have sworn never to set foot of mine, or horse's foot of mine, pending the present relations between us, while I breathe the breath of life." And here, catching my guardian's eye, he broke into one of his tremendous laughs, which seemed to shake even the motionless little market town. "Are the Dedlocks down here, Lawrence?" said my guardian, as we drove along, and Mr. Boythorn trotted on the green turf by the roadside. "Sir Arrogant Numbskull is here," replied Mr. Boythorn. "Ha! Sir Arrogant is here, and I am glad to say he has been laid by the heels here. My lady, in naming whom he always made a courtly gesture, as if particularly to exclude her from any part in the quarrel, is expected, I believe, daily. I am not in the least surprised that she postpones her appearance as long as possible. Whatever can induce that transcendent woman to marry the effigy and figurehead of a baronet is one of the most impenetrable mysteries that ever baffled human inquiry. I suppose, said my guardian, laughing, we may set foot in the park while we are here. The prohibition does not extend to us, does it? I can lay no prohibition on my guests, he said, bending his head to Ada and me with a smiling politeness which sat so gracefully upon him, except in the matter of their departure. I am only sorry that I cannot have the happiness of being their escort about Chesney Wold, which is a very fine place. But by the light of this summer day, Jarndyce, if you call upon the owner while you stay with me, you are likely to have but a cool reception. He carries himself like an 8-day clock at all times, like one of a race of 8-day clocks in gorgeous cases that never go and never went. But he will have some extra stiffness, I can promise you, for the friends of his friend and neighbour Boythorn. I shall not put him to the proof, said my guardian. He is as indifferent to the honour of knowing me, I dare say, as I am to the honour of knowing him. The air of the grounds, and perhaps such a view of the house as any other sightseer might get, are quite enough for me. Well, said Mr. Boythorn, I am glad of it on the whole. It's in better keeping. I am looked upon about here as a second Ajax defying the lightning. When I go into our little church on a Sunday, a considerable part of the inconsiderable congregation expect to see me drop, scorched and withered, on the pavement, under the deadlock displeasure. I've no doubt that he is surprised that I don't, for he is, by heaven, the most self-satisfied and the shallowest of the most coxcombical and utterly brainless ass. Our coming to the ridge of a hill we had been ascending enabled our friend to point out Chesney Wold itself to us, and diverted his attention from its master. It was a picturesque old house in a fine park, richly wooded. Among the trees, and not far from the residence, he pointed out the spire of the little church of which he had spoken. Oh, the solemn woods over which the light and shadow travelled swiftly, as if heavenly wings were sweeping on benignant errands, the smooth green slopes, the glittering water, the garden where the flowers were so symmetrically arranged in the clusters of richest colours. How beautiful they looked! The house, with gable and chimney and tower and turret and a dark doorway, and broad terrace walk twining among the balustrades, of which, lying heaped upon the vases, there was one great flush of roses, scarcely seemed real in its light solidity and in the serene and peaceful hush that rested on all around it. To Ada and to me, that above all appeared to be the pervading influence. On everything, the house, garden, terrace, green slopes, water, old oak, fern, moss, woods again, and far away across the openings in the prospect to the distance lying wide before us with a purple bloom upon it, there seemed to be such undisturbed repose. When we came to the little village and passed a small inn with the sign of the Dedlock Arms swinging over the road in front, Mr. Boythorn interchanged greetings with a young gentleman sitting on a bench outside the inn door, who had some fishing tackle lying beside him. "That's the housekeeper's grandson, Mr. Rouncewell by name," said he, "and he's in love with a pretty girl up at the house. Lady Dedlock has taken a fancy to the pretty girl, and is going to keep her about her own fair person, an honour which my young friend himself does not at all appreciate. However, he can't marry just yet, even if his Rosebud were willing, so he is fain to make the best of it. In the meanwhile he comes here pretty often for a day or two at a time." "To fish?" "He and the pretty girl are engaged, Mr. Boythorn?" asked Ada. "Why, my dear Miss Clare," he returned, "I think they may perhaps understand each other, but you will see them soon, I dare say, and I must learn from you on such a point, not you from me." Ada blushed, and Mr. Boythorn, trotting forward on his comely grey horse, dismounted at his own door, and stood ready with an extended arm and uncovered head to welcome us when we arrived. He lived in a pretty house, formerly the parsonage house, with a lawn in front, a bright flower garden at the side, and a well-stocked orchard and kitchen garden in the rear, enclosed with a venerable wall that had of itself ripened a ruddy look. But, indeed, everything about the place wore an aspect of maturity and abundance. The old lime-tree walk was like green cloisters. The very shadows of the cherry-trees and apple-trees were heavy with fruit. The gooseberry bushes were so laden that their branches arched and rested on the earth. The strawberries and raspberries grew in like profusion, and the peaches basked by the hundred on the wall, tumbled about among the spread nets and the glass frames, sparkling and winkling in the sun. There were such heaps of drooping pods and marrows and cucumbers that every foot of ground appeared a vegetable treasury, while the smell of sweet herbs and all kinds of wholesome growth, to say nothing of the neighbouring meadows where the hay was carrying, made the whole air a great nosegay. Such stillness and composure reigned within the orderly precincts of the old red wall that even the feathers hung in garlands to scare the birds hardly stirred, and the wall had such a ripening influence that where here and there high up a disused nail and a scrap of list still clung to it, it was easy to fancy that they had mellowed with the changing seasons, and that they had rusted and decayed according to the common fate. The house, though a little disorderly in comparison with the garden, was a real old house, with settles in the chimneys of the brick-floored kitchen and great beams across the ceilings. On one side of it was the terrible piece of ground in dispute, where Mr. Boythorn maintained a sentry in a smock-frock day and night, whose duty was supposed to be, in cases of aggression, immediately to ring a large bell hung up there for the purpose, to unchain a great bulldog established in a kennel as his ally, and generally to deal destruction on the enemy. Not content with these precautions, Mr. Boythorn had himself composed and posted there, on painted boards to which his name was attached in large letters, the following solemn warnings: "Beware of the bulldog. He is most ferocious. Lawrence Boythorn. The blunderbuss is loaded with slugs. Lawrence Boythorn. Man traps and spring guns are set here at all times of the day and night. Lawrence Boythorn. Take notice that any person or persons audaciously presuming to trespass on this property will be punished with the utmost severity of private chastisement and prosecuted with the utmost rigour of the law. Lawrence Boythorn." These he showed us from the drawing-room window, while his bird was hopping about his head. He laughed to that extent as he pointed them out that I really thought he would have hurt himself. "But this is taking a good deal of trouble," said Mr. Skimpole in his light way, "when you are not in earnest after all." "Not in earnest?" returned Mr. Boythorn with unspeakable warmth. "Not in earnest? If I could have hoped to train him, I would have bought a lion instead of that dog, and would have turned him loose upon the first intolerable robber who should dare to make an encroachment on my rights. Let Sir Leicester Dedlock consent to come out and decide this question by single combat, and I will meet him with any weapon known to mankind in any age or country. I am that much in earnest, not more." We arrived at his house on a Saturday. On the Sunday morning we all set forth to walk to the little church in the park. Entering the park almost immediately by the disputed ground, we pursued a pleasant footpath winding among the verdant turf and the beautiful trees until it brought us to the church porch. The congregation was extremely small and quite a rustic one, with the exception of a large muster of servants from the house, some of whom were already in their seats, while others were yet dropping in. There were some stately footmen, and there was a perfect picture of an old coachman, who looked as if he were the official representative of all the pomps and vanities that had ever been put into his coach. There was a very pretty show of young women, and above them the handsome old face and responsible portly figure of the housekeeper towered preeminent. The pretty girl of whom Mr. Boythorn had told us was close by her. She was so very pretty that I might have known her by her beauty, even if I had not seen how blushingly conscious she was of the eyes of the young fisherman, whom I discovered not far off. One face, not an agreeable one, though it was handsome, seemed maliciously watchful of this pretty girl, and indeed of every one and everything there. It was a Frenchwoman's. As the bell was yet ringing and the great people were not yet come, I had leisure to glance over the church, which smelt as earthy as a grave, and to think what a shady, ancient, solemn little church it was. The windows, heavily shaded by trees, emitted a subdued light that made the faces all around me pale, and darkened the old brasses in the pavement, and the time-damp worn monuments rendered the sunshine in a little porch where a monotonous ringer was working at the bell inestimably bright. But a stir in that direction, a gathering of reverential awe in the rustic faces, and a blandly ferocious assumption on the part of Mr. Boythorn of being resolutely unconscious of somebody's existence, forewarned me that the great people were come, and that the service was going to begin. Enter not into judgment with thy servant, O Lord, for in thy sight shall I ever forget the rapid beating of my heart, occasioned by the look I met as I stood up. I shall ever forget the manner in which those handsome, proud eyes seemed to spring out of their languor and to hold mine. It was only a moment before I cast mine down, released again, if I may say so, on my book, but I knew the beautiful face quite well in that short space of time. And very strangely there was something quickened within me, associated with the lonely days at my godmother's. Yes, away even to the days when I had stood on tiptoe to dress myself at my little glass after dressing my doll. And this, though I had never seen this lady's face before in all my life. I was quite sure of it, absolutely certain. It was easy to know that the ceremonious, gouty, grey-haired gentleman, the only other occupant of the great pew, was Celesta Dedlock, and that the lady was Lady Dedlock. But why her face should be, in a confused way, like a broken glass to me, in which I saw scraps of old remembrances, and why I should be so fluttered and troubled, for I was still, by having casually met her eyes, I could not think. I felt it to be an unmeaning weakness in me, and tried to overcome it by attending to the words I heard. Then, very strangely, I seemed to hear them, not in the reader's voice, but in the well-remembered voice of my godmother, that made me think, did Lady Dedlock's face accidentally resemble my godmother's? It might be that it did, a little, but the expression was so different, and the stern decision which had worn into my godmother's face like weather into rocks was so completely wanting in the face before me, that it could not be that resemblance which had struck me. Neither did I know the loftiness and haughtiness of Lady Dedlock's face at all in any one, and yet I, little Esther Summerson, the child who lived a life apart, and on whose birthday there was no rejoicing, seemed to arise before my own eyes, evoked out of the past by some power in this fashionable lady, whom I had not only entertained no fancy that I had never seen, but whom I perfectly well knew I had never seen until that hour. It made me tremble to be so thrown into this unaccountable agitation that I was conscious of being distressed, even by the observation of the French maid, though I knew she had been looking watchfully here and there and everywhere from the moment of her coming into the church. By degrees, though very slowly, I at last overcame my strange emotion. After a long time I looked towards Lady Dedlock again. It was while they were preparing to sing before the sermon. She took no heed of me, and the beating at my heart was gone. Neither did it revive for more than a few moments when she once or twice afterwards glanced at Ada or at me through her glass. The service being concluded, Celesta gave his arm with much taste and gallantry to Lady Dedlock, though he was obliged to walk by the help of a thick stick, and escorted her out of church to the pony carriage in which they had come. The servants then dispersed, so did the congregation, whom Celesta had contemplated all along. Mr. Skimpole said to Mr. Boythorn's infinite delight, as if he were a considerable landed proprietor in heaven. "He believes he is," pursued Mr. Skimpole very unexpectedly to Mr. Boythorn. "It is agreeable to see a man of that sort." "Is it?" said Mr. Boythorn. "Say that he wants to patronize me," pursued Mr. Skimpole. "Very well, I don't object." "I do," said Mr. Boythorn with great vigour. "Do you really?" returned Mr. Skimpole in his easy, light vein. "But that's taking trouble, surely, and why should you take trouble? Here am I, content to receive things childishly as they fall out, and I never take trouble. I come down here, for instance, and I find a mighty potentate exacting homage. Very well, I say, mighty potentate, here is my homage. It's easier to give than to withhold it. Here it is. If you have anything of an agreeable nature to show me, I shall be happy to see it. If you have anything of an agreeable nature to give me, I shall be happy to accept it." Mighty potentate replies, in effect, "This is a sensible fellow. I find him accord with my digestion and my bilious system. It doesn't impose upon me the necessity of rolling myself up like a hedgehog. with my points outwards, I expand, I open, I turn my silver lining outward like Milton's cloud, and it's more agreeable to both of us. That's my view of such things, speaking as a child." "But suppose you went down somewhere else to-morrow," said Mr. Boythorn, "where there was the opposite of that fellow, or of this fellow. How then?" "How then?" said Mr. Skimpole, with an appearance of the utmost simplicity and candour. "Just the same, then, I should say, my esteemed Boythorn, to make you the personification of our imaginary friend. My esteemed Boythorn, you object to the mighty potentate. Very good. So do I. I take it that my business in the social system is to be agreeable. I take it that everybody's business in the social system is to be agreeable. It's a system of harmony. In short, therefore, if you object, I object. Now, excellent Boythorn, let us go to dinner." "But excellent Boythorn might say," returned our host, swelling and growing very red, "I'll be—" "I understand," said Mr. Skimpole. "Very likely he would." "If I will go to dinner," cried Mr. Boythorn in a violent burst, and stopping to strike his stick upon the ground. And he would probably add, "Is there such a thing as principle, Mr. Harold Skimpole?" To which Harold Skimpole would reply, "You know," he returned in his gayest manner and with his most ingenuous smile, "upon my life I have not the least idea. I don't know what it is you call by that name, or where it is, or who possesses it. If you possess it and find it comfortable, I am quite delighted, and congratulate you heartily. But I know nothing about it, I assure you, for I am a mere child, and I lay no claim to it, and I don't want it. So you see, excellent Boythorn and I would go to dinner after all." This was one of the many little dialogues between them which I always expected to end, and which I dare say would have ended, under other circumstances, in some violent explosion on the part of our host. But he had so high a sense of his hospitable and responsible position as our entertainer, and my guardian laughed so sincerely at and with Mr. Skimpole, as a child who blew bubbles and broke them all day long, that matters never went beyond this point. Mr. Skimpole, who always seemed quite unconscious of having been on delicate ground, then betook himself to beginning some sketch in the park which he never finished, or to playing fragments of airs on the piano, or to singing scraps of songs, or to lying down on his back under a tree and looking at the sky, which he couldn't help thinking, he said, was what it was meant for. It suited him so exactly. "Enterprise and effort," he would say to us, on his back, "are delightful to me. I believe I am truly cosmopolitan. I have the deepest sympathy with them. I lie in a shady place like this, and think of an adventurous spirit's going to the North Pole, or penetrating to the heart of the torrid zone, with admiration. Mercenary creatures ask, what's the use of a man's going to the North Pole? What good does it do? I can't say. But for anything I can say, he may go for the purpose, though he don't know it, of employing my thoughts as I lie here. Take an extreme case. Take the case of the slaves on American plantations. I dare say they are worked hard. I dare say they don't altogether like it. I dare say theirs is an unpleasant experience on the whole. But when they people landscape for me, they give it a poetry for me, and perhaps that is one of the pleasanter objects of their existence. I'm very sensible of it, if it be, and I shouldn't wonder if it were." I always wondered on these occasions whether he ever thought of Mrs. Skimpole and the children, and in what point of view they presented themselves to his cosmopolitan mind. So far as I can understand, they rarely presented themselves at all. The week had gone round to the Saturday follow the beating of my heart in the church, and every day had been so bright and blue that to ramble in the woods and to see the light striking down among the transparent leaves, sparkling in the beautiful interlacings of the shadows of the trees, while the birds poured out their songs and the air was drowsy with the hum of insects, had been most delightful. We had one favourite spot, deep in moss and last year's leaves, where there were some felled trees from which the bark was all stripped off. Seated among these, we looked through a green vista supported by thousands of natural columns, the whitened stems of trees upon a distant prospect, made so radiant by its contrast with the shade in which we sat, and made so precious by the arched perspective through which we saw it, that it was like a glimpse of the better land. Upon the Saturday we sat there, Mr. Jarndyce, Ada, and I, until we heard thunder muttering in the distance, and felt the large raindrops rattle through the leaves. The weather had been all week extremely sultry, but the storm broke so suddenly upon us, at least in that sheltered spot, that before we reached the outskirts of the wood the thunder and lightning were frequent, and the rain came plunging through the leaves as if every drop were a great leaden bead. As it was not a time for standing among the trees, we ran out of the wood and up and down the moss-grown steps which crossed the plantation fence like two broad stave ladders placed back to back, and made for a keeper's lodge which was close at hand. We had often noticed the dark beauty of this lodge standing in a deep twilight of trees, and how the ivy clustered over it, and how there was a steep hollow near where we had once seen the keeper's dog dive down into the fern as if it were water. The lodge was so dark within, now the sky was overcast, that we clearly saw the man who came to the door when we took shelter there, and put 2 chairs for Ada and me. The lattice windows were all thrown open, and we sat just within the doorway, watching the storm. It was grand to see how the wind awoke and bent the trees, and drove the rain before it like a cloud of smoke, and to hear the solemn thunder, to see the lightning, and while thinking with awe of the tremendous powers by which our little lives are encompassed, consider how beneficent they are, and how upon the smallest flower and leaf there was already a freshness poured from all this seeming rage, which seemed to make creation new again. Is it not dangerous to sit in so an exposed place? "Oh no, Esther dear," said Ada quietly. Ada said it to me, but I had not spoken. The beating of my heart came back again. I have never heard the voice, as I had never seen the face, but it affected me in the same strange way. Again in a moment there arose before my mind innumerable pictures of myself. Lady Dedlock had taken shelter in the lodge before our arrival there, and had come out of the gloom within. She stood behind my chair with her hand upon it. I saw her with her hand close to my shoulder when I turned my head. "Have I frightened you?" she said. "No, it was not fright. Why should I be frightened?" "I believe," said Lady Dedlock to my guardian, "I have the pleasure of speaking to Mr. Jarndyce." "Your remembrance does me more honour than I had supposed it would, Lady Dedlock," he returned. "I recognized you in church on Sunday. I am sorry that any local disputes of Sir Leicester's, they are not of his seeking, however, I believe, should render it a matter of some absurd difficulty to show you any attention here." "I am aware of the circumstances," returned my guardian with a smile, "and am sufficiently obliged." She had given him her hand in an indifferent way that seemed habitual to her, and spoke in a correspondingly indifferent manner, though in a very pleasant voice. She was as graceful as she was beautiful, perfectly self-possessed, and had the air, I thought, of being able to attract and interest any one she had thought it worth her while. The keeper had brought her a chair, on which she sat in the middle of the porch between us. "Is the young gentleman disposed of whom you wrote to Sir Leicester about, and whose wishes Sir Leicester was sorry not to have it in his power to advance in any way?" she said over her shoulder to my guardian. "I hope so," said he. She seemed to respect him, and even wished to conciliate him. There was something very winning in her haughty manner, and it became more familiar, I was going to say more easy, but that could hardly be, as she spoke to him over her shoulder. "I presume this is your other ward, Miss Clare." He presented Ada in form. "You will lose the disinterested part of your Don Quixote character," said Lady Dedlock, Mr. Jarndyce over her shoulder again, "if you only redress the wrongs of beauty like this. But present me," and she turned full upon me, "to this young lady too." "Miss Summerson is my ward," said Mr. Jarndyce. "I am responsible to no Lord Chancellor in her case." "Has Miss Summerson lost both her parents?" said my lady. "Yes." "She is very fortunate in her guardian." Lady Dedlock looked at me, and I looked at her, and said I was indeed. All at once she turned from me with a hasty air, almost expressive of displeasure or dislike, and spoke to him over her shoulder again. "Ages have passed since we were in the habit of meeting, Mr. Jarndyce." "A long time. At least I thought it was a long time till I saw you last Sunday," he returned. "What, even you are a courtier, or think it necessary to become one to me?" she said with some disdain. "I have achieved that reputation, I suppose." "You have achieved so much, Lady Dedlock," said my guardian, "that you pay some little penalty, I dare say, but none to me." "So much," she repeated, slightly laughing. "Yes." with her air of superiority and power and fascination, and I know not what. She seemed to regard Ada and me as little more than children. So as she slightly laughed and afterwards sat looking at the rain, she was as self-possessed and as free to occupy herself with her own thoughts as if she had been alone. "I think you knew my sister when we were abroad together better than you know me," she said, looking at him again. "Yes, we happened to meet oftener," he returned. "We went our several ways," said Lady Dedlock, "and had little in common even before we agreed to differ. It is to be regretted, I suppose, but it could not be helped." Lady Dedlock again sat looking at the rain. The storm soon began to pass upon its way. The shower greatly abated, and the lightning ceased. Thunder rolled among the distant hills, and the sun began to glisten on the wet leaves and the falling rain. As we sat there silently, we saw a little pony phaeton come towards us at a merry pace. "The messenger is coming back, my lady," said the keeper, "with the carriage." As it drove up, we saw there were two people inside. There alighted from it with some cloaks and wrappers, first the Frenchwoman who I had seen in church, and secondly the pretty girl. The Frenchwoman with a defiant confidence, the pretty girl confused and hesitating. "What now?" said Lady Dedlock. "Two?" "I am your maid, my lady, at present," said the Frenchwoman. "The message was for the attendant." "I was afraid you might mean me, my lady," said the pretty girl. "I did mean you, child," replied her mistress calmly. "Put that shawl on me." She slightly stooped her shoulders to receive it, and the pretty girl lightly dropped it in its place. The Frenchwoman stood unnoticed, looking on with her lips very tightly set. "I am sorry," said Lady Dedlock to Mr. Jarndyce, "that we are not likely to renew our former acquaintance. You will allow me to send the carriage back for your two wards. It should be here directly." But as he on no account would accept this offer, she took a graceful leave of Ada, none of me, and put her hand upon his proffered arm, and got into the carriage, which was a little low park carriage with a hood. "Come in, child," she said to the pretty girl. "I shall want you. Go on." The carriage rolled away, and the Frenchwoman with the wrapper she had brought hanging over her arm remained standing where she had alighted. I suppose there is nothing pride can so little bear with as pride itself, and that she was punished for her imperious manner. Her retaliation was the most singular I could have imagined. She remained perfectly still until the carriage had turned into the drive, and then, without the least discomposure of countenance, slipped off her shoes, left them on the ground, and walked deliberately in the same direction through the wettest of the wet grass. "Is that young woman mad?" said my guardian. "Oh no, sir," said the keeper, who with his wife was looking after her. "Hortense is not one of that sort. She has a good headpiece as the best, but she's mortal high and passionate, powerful high and passionate, and what with having notice to leave, and having others put above her, she don't take kindly to it." "But why should she walk shoeless through all that water?" said my guardian. "Why indeed, sir, unless it's to cool her down," said the man. "Unless she fancies it's blood," said the woman. "She'd as soon walk through that as anything else, I think, when her own's up." We passed not far from the house a few minutes afterwards. Peaceful as it had looked when we first saw it, it looked even more so now, with the diamond spray glittering all about it, a light wind blowing, the birds no longer hushed but singing strongly, everything refreshed by the late rain, and the little carriage shining at the doorway like a fairy carriage made of silver. Still, very steadfastly and quietly walking towards it, a peaceful figure too in the landscape, went Mademoiselle Hortense, shoeless, through the wet grass. Chapter 19. Moving on. It is the long vacation in the regions of Chancery Lane. The good ships Law and Equity, those teak-built, copper-bottomed, iron-fastened, brazen-faced, and not by any means fast-sailing clippers, are laid up in ordinary. The Flying Dutchman, with a crew of ghostly clients, imploring all whom they may encounter to peruse their papers, has drifted for the time being heaven knows where. The courts are all shut up. The public office lies in hot sleep. Westminster Hall itself is a shady solitude, where nightingales might sing, and a tenderer class of suitors than is usually found there walk. The Temple, Chancery Lane, Sergeant's Inn, and Lincoln's Inn, even unto the Fields, are like tidal harbours at low water, where stranded proceedings, officers at anchor, idle clerks lounging on top-sided stools that will not recover their perpendicular until the current term sets in, lie high and dry upon the ooze of the long vacation. Outer doors of chambers are shut up by the score. Messages and parcels are to be left at the porter's lodge by the bushel. A crop of grass would grow in the chinks of the stone pavement outside Lincoln's Inn Hall, but that the ticket porters, who have nothing to do beyond sitting in the shade there, with their white aprons over their heads to keep the flies off, grub it up and eat thoughtfully. There's only one judge in town. Even he only comes twice a week to sit in chambers. If the country folks of those assize towns on his circuit could see him now, no full-bottomed wig, no red petticoats, no fur, no javelin men, no white wands, merely a close-shaven gentleman in white trousers and a white hat, with a sea bronze on the judicial countenance, and a strip of bark peeled by the solar rays from the judicial nose, who calls in at the shellfish shop as he comes along and drinks iced ginger beer. The bar of England is scattered over the face of the earth. How can England get on through 4 long summer months without its bar, which, its acknowledged refuge in adversity and its only legitimate triumph in prosperity, is beside the question. Assuredly, that shield and buckler of Britannia are not in present wear. The learned gentleman, who was always so tremendously indignant at the unprecedented outrage committed on the feelings of his client by the opposite party that he never seems likely to recover, is doing so infinitely better than might be expected in Switzerland. The learned gentleman who does the withering business and who blights all opponents with his gloomy sarcasm is as merry as a grig at a French watering place. The learned gentleman who weeps by the pint on the smallest provocation has not shed a tear these 6 weeks. The very learned gentleman who has cooled the natural heat of his gingerly complexion in pools and fountains of law until he has become great in knotty arguments for term time, when he poses the drowsy bench with legal chaff, inexplicable to the uninitiated, and to most of the initiated too, is roaming with characteristic delight in aridity and dust about Constantinople. Other dispersed fragments of the same great Palladium are to be found on the canals of Venice, at the second cataract of the Nile, in the baths of Germany, and sprinkled on the sea sand all over the English coast. Scarcely one is to be encountered in the deserted region of Chancery Lane. If such a lonely member of the bar do flit across the waste and come upon a prowling suitor who is unable to leave off haunting the scenes of his anxiety, they frighten one another and retreat into opposite shades. It is the hottest long vacation known for many years. All the young clerks are madly in love, and according to their various degrees of pine for bliss with the beloved object, at Margate, Ramsgate, or Gravesend. All the middle-aged clerks think their families are too large. All the unowned dogs who stray into the Inns of Court and pant about staircases and other dry places, seeking water, give howls of aggravation. All the blind men's dogs in the streets draw their masters against pumps or trip them over buckets. A shop with a sun-blind and a watered pavement and a bowl of gold and silver fish in the window is a sanctuary. Temple Bar gets so hot that it is to the adjacent Strand and Fleet Street what a heater is in an urn, and keeps them simmering all night. There are offices about the Inns of Court in which a man might be cool, if any coolness were worth purchasing at such a price in dullness, but the little thoroughfares immediately outside those retirements seem to blaze. In Mr. Crook's court it is so hot that the people turn their houses inside out and sit in chairs upon the pavement, Mr. Crook included, who there pursues his studies with his cat, who never is too hot, by his side. The Sol's Arms has discontinued the harmonic meetings for the season, and Little Swills is engaged at the pastoral gardens down the river, where he comes out in quite an innocent manner and sings comic ditties of a juvenile complexion, calculated, as the bill says, not to wound the feelings of the most fastidious mind. Over all the legal neighbourhood there hangs, like some great veil of rust or gigantic cobweb, the idleness and pensiveness of the long vacation. Mr. Snagsby, law stationer of Crook's Court, Cursitor Street, is sensible of the influence, not only in his mind as a sympathetic and contemplative man, but also in his business as a law stationer aforesaid. He has more leisure for musing in Staple Inn and in the Rolls Yard during the long vacation than other seasons, and he says to the two prentices, "What a thing it is in such a hot weather to think that you live in an island with the sea rolling and a-bowling right around you." Guster is busy in the little drawing-room on this present afternoon in the long vacation, for Mr. and Mrs. Snagsby have it in a contemplation to receive company. The expected guests are rather select than numerous, being Mr. and Mrs. Chadband and no more. For Mr. Chadband's being much given to describe himself, both verbally and in writing, as a vessel, he is occasionally mistaken by strangers for a gentleman connected with navigation. But he is, as he expresses it, in the ministry. Mr. Chadband is remarkable to say, on the greatest of subjects. Mr. Chadband is attached to no particular denomination, and is considered by his persecutors to have nothing so very remarkable to say on the greatest of subjects as to render his volunteering on his own account at all incumbent on his conscience. But he has his followers, and Mrs. Snagsby is of the number. Mrs. Snagsby has but recently taken a passage upward by the vessel Chadband, and her attention was attracted to that bark A1 when she was something flushed by the hot weather. "My little woman," says Mr. Snagsby to the sparrows in Staple Inn, "likes to have her religion rather sharp, you see." Sir Guster is much impressed, regarding herself for the time being as the handmaid of Chadband, whom she knows to be endowed with the gift of holding forth for 4 hours at a stretch, prepares the little drawing-room for tea. All the furniture is shaken and dusted. The portraits of Mr. and Mrs. Snagsby are touched up with a wet cloth. The best tea service is set forth, and there is excellent provision made of dainty new bread, crusty twists, cool fresh butter, thin slices of ham, tongue, and German sausage, and delicate little rows of anchovies nestling in parsley, not to mention new-laid eggs to be brought up warm in a napkin, and hot buttered toast. For Chadband is rather a consuming vessel, the persecutors say a gorging vessel, and can wield such weapons of the flesh as a knife and fork remarkably well. Mr. Snagsby, in his best coat, looking at all the preparations when they are completed, and coughing his cough of deference behind his hand, says to Mrs. Snagsby, "What time did you expect Mr. and Mrs. Chadband, my love?" "At 6, says Mrs. Snagsby. Mr. Snagsby observes in a mild and casual way that "it's gone, that." "Perhaps you'd like to begin without them," is Mrs. Snagsby's reproachful remark. Mr. Snagsby does look as if he would like it very much, but he says with his cough of mildness, "No, my dear, I merely named the time." "What's time?" says Mrs. Snagsby. "To eternity." "Very true, my dear," says Mr. Snagsby. "Only when a person lays in victuals for tea, a person does it with a view, perhaps, more to time. And when a time is named for having tea, it's better to come up to it." "To come up to it," Mrs. Snagsby repeats with severity. "Up to it, as if Mr. Chadband was a fighter." "Not at all, my dear," says Mr. Snagsby. Here Guster, who had been looking out of the bedroom window, comes rustling and scratching down the little staircase like a popular ghost, and falling flush into the drawing-room, announces that Mr. and Mrs. Chadband have appeared in the court. The bell at the inner door in the passage immediately thereafter tinkling, she is admonished by Mrs. Snagsby, on pain of instant reconsignment to her patron's safe, not to omit the ceremony of announcement. Much discomposed in her nerves, which were previously in the best order, by this threat, she so fearfully mutilates that point of state as to announce "Mr. and Mrs. Cheeseming, at least, which I mean to say, what's her name?" and retires conscience-stricken from the presence. Mr. Chadband is a large yellow man with a fat smile and the general appearance of having a good deal of train oil in his system. Mrs. Chadband is a stern, severe-looking, silent woman. Mr. Chadband moves softly and cumbrously, not unlike a bear who has been taught to walk upright. He is very much embarrassed about the arm, as if they were inconvenient to him and he wanted to grovel. He is very much in a perspiration about the head,
and never speaks without first putting up his great hand, as delivering a token to his hearers that he is going to edify them. My friends, says Mr. Chadband, peace be on this house, on the master thereof, on the mysteries thereof, on the young maidens and on the young men. My friends, why do I wish for peace? What is peace? Is it war? No. Is it strife? No. It is lovely and gentle and beautiful and pleasant, and serene and joyful. Oh, yes, therefore, my friends, I wish for peace upon you and yours. In consequence of Mrs. Snagsby looking deeply edified, Mr. Snagsby thinks it expedient on the whole to say amen, which is well received. Now, my friends, proceeds Mr. Chadband, since I am upon this theme, Guster presents herself to Mrs. Snagsby in a spectral bass voice, without removing her eyes from Chadband, says with dreadful distinctness, go away. Now, my friends, says Chadband, since I am upon the theme, and in my lowly path improving it, Guster is heard unaccountably to murmur 1782. The spectral voice repeats it more solemnly, go away. Now, my friends, says Mr. Chadband, I will inquire in the spirit of love. Still Guster reiterates 1782. Mr. Chadband, pausing with the resignation of a man accustomed to be persecuted, and languidly folding his chin into his fat smile, says, let us hear the maiden. Speak, maiden. 1782, if you please, sir. Which he wished to know what the shilling were for, says Guster, breathless. For, returns Mrs. Chadband, for is fair. Guster replied that he insists on 1 and 8p, or on Summersizing the party. Mrs. Snagsby and Mrs. Chadband are proceeding to grow shrill in indignation, when Mr. Chadband quiets the tumult by lifting up his hand. My friend, says he, I remember a duty unfilled yesterday. It is right that I should be chastened in some penalty. I ought not to murmur. Rachel, pay the 8p. While Mrs. Snagsby, drawing her breath, looks hard at Mr. Snagsby, who should say, you hear this apostle. While Mr. Chadband glows with humility and train oil, Mrs. Chadband pays the money. It is Mrs. Chadband's habit, it is the head and front of his pretensions indeed, to keep this sort of debtor and creditor account in the smallest items, and to post it publicly on the most trivial occasions. My friends, says Chadband, 8p is not much. It might justly have been 1 and 4p. It might justly have been half a crown. Oh, let us be joyful. Oh, let us be joyful. With which remark, which appears from its sound to be an extract in verse, Mr. Chadband stalks to the table, and before taking up a chair, lifts his admonitory hand. My friends, says he, what is this which we now behold as being spread before us? Refreshment? Do we need refreshment then, my friends? We do. And why do we need refreshment, my friends? Because we are but mortal, because we are but sinful, because we are but of the earth, because we are not of the air. Can we fly, my friends? We cannot. Why can we not fly, my friend? Mr. Snagsby, presuming in the success of his last point, ventures to observe in a cheerful and rather knowing tone, no wings, but is immediately frowned down by Mrs. Snagsby. I say, my friends, pursues Mr. Chadband, utterly rejecting and obliterating Mr. Snagsby's suggestion, why we cannot fly? Is it because we are calculated to walk? It is. Could we walk, my friends, without strength? We could not. What should we do without strength, my friends? Our legs would refuse to bear us. Our knees would double up. Our ankles would turn over. We should come to the ground. And then from whence, my friends, in a human point of view, do we derive that strength that is necessary to our limbs? Is it, says Chadband, glancing over the table, from bread in various forms, from butter which is churned from the milk which is yielded unto us by the cow, from the eggs which are laid by the fowl, from ham, from tongue, from sausage, and from such like? And let us partake of the good things which are set before us. The persecutors deny that there was any particular gift in Mr. Chadband's piling verbose flights of stairs, one upon the other, after this fashion. But this can only be received as proof of their determination to persecute, as it must be within everybody's experience that the Chadband style of oratory is widely received and much admired. Mr. Chadband, however, having concluded for the present, sits down at Mr. Snagsby's table and lays about him prodigiously. The conversion of nutriment of any sort into oil of the quality already mentioned appears to be a process so inseparable from the constitution of this exemplary vessel, that in beginning to eat and drink, he may be described as always becoming a kind of considerable oil mills, or other large factory for the production of that article on a wholesale scale. On the present evening of the long vacation in Cook's Court, Cursitor Street, he does such a powerful stroke of business that the warehouse appears to be quite full when the works cease. At this period of the entertainment, Guster, who has never recovered from her first failure, but has neglected no possible or impossible means of bringing the establishment and herself into contempt, among which may be briefly enumerated her unexpectedly performing clashing military music on Mr. Chadband's head with plates, and afterwards crowning that gentleman with muffins, at which period of the entertainment Guster whispers to Mr. Snagsby that he is wanted, and being wanted in the, not to put too fine a point in it, in the shop, says Mr. Snagsby, rising. Perhaps this good company will excuse me for half a minute. Mr. Snagsby descends and finds the two prentices contemplating a police constable, who holds a ragged boy by the arm. Why, bless my heart, says Mr. Snagsby, what's the matter? This boy, says the constable, though he's repeatedly told us he won't move on. I'm always a moving on, sir, cries the boy, wiping away his grimy tears with his arm. I've always been a moving and a moving on, ever since I was born. Where can I possibly move to, sir? More nor I do move. He won't move on, says the constable calmly, with a slight professional hitch of his neck, involving its better settlement in his stiff stop. Although he's been repeatedly cautioned, and therefore I'm obliged to take him into custody. He's as obstinate as a young Goloff, as I know. He won't move on. Oh, my eye, where can I move to? Cries the boy, clutching quite desperately at his hair and beating his bare feet upon the floor of Mr. Snagsby's passage. Don't you come none of that, I shall make blessed short work of you, says the constable, giving him a passionless shake. My instructions are that you're to move on. I've told you so 500 times. But where? Cries the boy. Well, really, constable, you know, says Mr. Snagsby wistfully, and coughing behind his hand, his cough of great perplexity and doubt, that really does seem a question. Where? Do you know? My instructions don't go into that, replies the constable. My instructions are that this boy is to move on. Do you hear, Joe? It's nothing to you or to anyone else. The great lights of the parliamentary sky have failed for some years in this business to set you an example of moving on. The one grand recipe remains for you, the profound philosophical prescription, the be-all and end-all of your strange existence upon earth. Move on. You are by no means to move off, Joe, for the great lights can't agree at all about that. Move on. Mr. Snagsby says nothing to this effect, says nothing at all indeed, but coughs his forlornest cough, expressive of no thoroughfare in any direction. By this time Mr. and Mrs. Chadband and Mr. Snagsby, hearing the altercation, have appeared upon the stairs. Guster having never left the end of the passage, the whole household are assembled. The simple question is, sir, says the constable, whether you know this boy. He says you do. Mrs. Snagsby, from her elevation, instantly cries out, No, he don't. My little woman, says Mr. Snagsby, looking up the staircase. My love, permit me. Pray have a moment's patience, my dear. I do know something of this lad, and what I know of him, I can't say that there's any harm, perhaps on the contrary, constable, to whom the law stationer relates his joyful and woeful experience, suppressing the half-crown fact. Well, says the constable, so far as it seems he had grounds for what he said. When I took him into custody up in Holborn, he said you knew him. On that, the young man who was in the crowd said he was acquainted with you, and you were a respectable housekeeper, and if I'd call and make the inquiry, you'd appear. The young man don't seem inclined to keep his word, but here is the young man. Enter Mr. Guppy, who nods to Mr. Snagsby and touches his hat with the chivalry of clerkship to the ladies on the stairs. I was strolling away from the office just now when I found this row going on, says Mr. Guppy to the law stationer. As your name was mentioned, I thought it was the right thing should be looked into. It was very good-natured of you, sir, says Mr. Snagsby. I'm obliged to you. And Mr. Snagsby relates his experience again, suppressing the half-crown fact. Now I know where you live, says the constable, and then to Joe, you live down at Tom All Alone's. That's a nice innocent place to live in, isn't it? I can't go and live in no nicer place, sir, replies Joe. They wouldn't have nothing to say to me if I was to go to a nice innocent place for to live. Who would go and let a nice innocent lodging to such a regular as me? You're very poor, ain't you? Says the constable. Yes, I am indeed, sir, very poor in general, replies Joe. I'll leave you to judge now. I took these 2 half-crowns out of him, says the constable, producing them to the company. I'm only putting my hand upon him. Then what's left, Mr. Snagsby, says Joe, out of a sovereign that was given to me by a lady in a whale, as she was a servant that's come to my crossing one night and asked to be shown this here house, and he asked what image you'd give the writing to died at, in the burying ground what he's buried in. She says to me, she says, are you the boy in the Inkwich? I says, yes, I says. She says to me, and she says, can you show them all the places? I says, yes, I can, I says. And she says to me to do it, and I've done it, and she give me a sovereign, and I hooked it.
I ain't had much of a sovereign either, says Joe with dirty tears.
For I had to pay both 5 bob down in Tom all Alon's, for they'd square it up to give me the change. And then a young man, he thieved another 5 while I was asleep. Another boy thieved 9pence, and the landlord, he stood drains around with a lot more on it. You don't expect anybody to believe this about the lady and the sovereign, do you? Says the constable, eyeing him aside with an ineffable disdain. Don't know as I do, sir, replies Joe. I don't expect nothing at all, sir, much, but that's the true history on it. Do you see what he is? The constable observes to the audience. Well, Mr. Snagsby, if I don't lock him up this time, will you engage for his moving on? No, cries Mrs. Snagsby from the stairs. My little woman, pleads her husband. Constable, I have no doubt he'll move on. You know you really must do it, says Mr. Snagsby. I'm every ways agreeable, sir, says the hapless Joe. Do it then, observes the constable. You know what you've got to do. Do it, and recollect that you won't get off so easy the next time. Catch hold of your money now. The sooner you're off, 5 mile off, the better for all parties. With this farewell hint, and pointing generally to the setting sun as a likely place to move on to, the constable bids his auditors good afternoon, and makes the echoes of Cook's Court perform slow music for him as he walks away on the shady side, carrying his iron-bound hat in his hand for a little ventilation. Now, Joe's improbable story concerning the lady and the sovereign had awakened more or less the curiosity of the company. Mr. Guppy, who had an inquiring mind in such matters of evidence, who had been suffering severely from the lassitude of the long vacation, takes that interest in the case that he enters on a regular cross-examination of the witness, which is found so interesting by the ladies that Mrs. Snagsby politely invites him to step upstairs and drink a cup of tea, if he will excuse the disarranged state of the tea table, consequent on their previous exertions. Mr. Guppy yielding his assent to this proposal, Joe is requested to follow into the drawing-room doorway, where Mr. Guppy takes him in hand as a witness, patting him into this shape, that shape, and the other shape, like a butterman dealing with so much butter, and worrying him according to the best models. Nor is the examination unlike many such model displays, both in respect of its eliciting nothing and of its being lengthy, for Mr. Guppy is sensible of his talent, and Mrs. Snagsby feels not only that it gratifies her inquisitive disposition, that it lifts her husband's establishment higher up in the law. During the progress of this keen encounter, the vessel Chadband, being merely engaged in the oil trade, gets around and waits to be floated off. Well, says Mr. Guppy, either this boy sticks to it like cobbler's wax, or there's something out of the common here that beats that ever came made to my way at Kenjin Carboys. Mrs. Chadband whispers to Mrs. Snagsby, who exclaims, You don't say so. For years, replied Mrs. Chadband. Has known Kenjin Carboy's office for years, Mrs. Snagsby triumphantly explains to Mr. Guppy. Mrs. Chadband, this gentleman's wife, Reverend Mr. Chadband. Oh, indeed, says Mr. Guppy. Before I married my present husband, says Mrs. Chadband. Was you a party in anything, ma'am? Says Mr. Guppy, transferring his cross-examination. No, not a party in anything, ma'am, says Mr. Guppy. Mrs. Chadband shakes her head. Perhaps you were acquainted with somebody who was a party in something, ma'am, says Mr. Guppy, who likes nothing better than to model his conversation on forensic principles. Not exactly that either, repeats Mr. Guppy. Very good. Pray, ma'am, was it a lady of your acquaintance who had some transactions? We will not at present say what transactions. With Kenjin Carboy's office, or was it a gentleman of your acquaintance? Take time, ma'am. We shall come to it presently. Man or woman, ma'am? Neither, says Mrs. Chadband as before. Oh, a child, says Mr. Guppy, throwing on the admiring Mrs. Snagsby the regular acute professional eye which is thrown on British jurymen. Now, ma'am, perhaps you have the kindness to tell us what child? You have got it at last, sir, says Mrs. Chadband with another hard-favoured smile. Well, sir, it was before your time, most likely, judging from your appearance. I was left in charge of a child named Esther Summerson, who was put out in life by Messrs. Kenge and Carboy. Miss Summerson, ma'am, cries Mr. Guppy, excited. I call her Esther Summerson, says Mrs. Chadband with austerity. There was no missing of the girl in my time. It was Esther. Esther do this, Esther do that, and she was made to do it. My dear ma'am, returns Mr. Guppy, moving across the small apartment, the humble individual who now addresses you received that young lady in London when she first came here from the establishment to which you have alluded. Allow me to have the pleasure of taking you by the hand. Mr. Chadband, at last seeing his opportunity, makes his accustomed signal and rises with a smoking head, which he dabs with his pocket handkerchief. Mrs. Snagsby whispers, "Hush." My friends, says Chadband, we have partaken in moderation, which was certainly not the case as far as he was concerned, of the comforts which have been provided for us. May this house live upon the fatness of the land. May corn and wine be plentiful therein. May it grow, may it thrive, may it prosper, may it advance, may it proceed, may it press forward. But, my friends, have we partaken of anything else? We have. My friends, of what else have we partaken? Of spiritual profit. Yes, from whence we derive that spiritual profit? My young friends, stand forth. Joe, thus apostrophised, gives a slouch backward, and another slouch forward, and another slouch to each side, and confronts the eloquent Chadband with evident doubts of his intentions. My young friends, says Chadband, you are to us a pearl, you are to us a diamond, you are to us a gem, you are to us a jewel. And why, my young friend? I don't know, replies Joe. I don't know nothing. My young friend, says Chadband, because you know nothing, that you are to us as a gem and a jewel, for what you are, my young friend. Are you a beast of the field, a bird of the air? No, a fish of the sea or river. No, you are a human boy, my young friend. A human boy. Oh, glorious to be a human boy. And why glorious, my young friend? Because you're capable of receiving the lessons of wisdom. Because you're capable of profiting by this discourse which I now deliver for your good. Because you are not a stick or a staff or stock or stone or a post or a pillar. O running stream of sparkling joy, to be a soaring human boy. And do you cool yourself in that stream now, my young friend? No. Why do you not cool yourself in that stream now? Because you are in a state of darkness, because you are in a state of obscurity, because you are in a state of sinfulness, because you are in a state of bondage. My young friend, what is bondage? Let us in a spirit of love inquire. At this threatening stage of the discourse, Joe, who seems to have been gradually going out of his mind, smears his right arm over his face and gives a terrible yawn. Mrs. Snagsby indignantly expresses her belief that he is the limb of the arch-fiend. My friends, says Mr. Chadband, with his persecuted chin folding itself into a fat smile again as he looks round, it is right that I should be humbled. It is right that I should be tried. It is right that I should be mortified. It is right that I should be corrected. I stumbled on Sabbath last when I thought with my pride of 3 hours improving. The account is now favourably balanced. My creditor has accepted a composition. Oh, let us be joyful, joyful, oh, let us be joyful. Great sensation on the part of Mrs. Snagsby. My friend, says Chadband, looking around him in conclusion, I will not proceed with my young friend now. Will you come tomorrow, my young friend, and inquire of this good lady where I am to be found to deliver a discourse unto you? And will you come like a thirsty swallow upon the next day, and upon the day after that, and upon the day after that, and upon many pleasant days to hear discourses? This with a cow-like lightness. Joe, whose immediate object seems to be to get away on any terms, gives a shuffling nod. Mr. Guppy then throws him a penny, and Mrs. Snagsby calls to Guster to see him safely out of the house. But before he goes downstairs, Mr. Snagsby loads him with some broken meats from the table, which he carries away, hugging in his arms. So Mr. Chadband, of whom the persecutors say that it is no wonder he should go on for any length of time uttering such abominable nonsense, but that the wonder rather is that he should ever leave off, having once the audacity to begin. Retires into private life until he invests a little capital of supper in the oil trade. Joe moves on, through the long vacation, down to Blackfriars Bridge, where he finds a baking stony corner wherein to settle his repast. And there he sits, munching and gnawing and looking up at the great cross on the summit of St. Paul's Cathedral, glittering above a red and violet tinted cloud of smoke. From the boy's face, one might suppose that sacred emblem to be, in his eyes, the crowning confusion of the great confused city, so golden, so high up, so far out of his reach. There he sits, the sun going down, the river running fast, the crowd flowing by him in two streams, everything moving on to some purpose and to one end, until he is stirred up and told to move on too.